Well, a little story. Chris Seaman was kind enough to loan me this book, Always a Catholic. And I looked at it and I saw that little kid on the front cover. And I thought, that reminds me of somebody. And then I kind of looked in the mirror. And with the exception of the fact that this kid has hair, it reminded me of when I was a little kid. And when my kids were little kids. And then I read the book and I thought, man, I wonder if I read the little autobiography or the biography about the author on the back, and I thought, well, this guy's just up the freeway a little ways. Why don't we ask him if he can come in and talk to us about this? Because there's a lot of people that have this situation with their kids. You know, keeping your kids in the faith is a big challenge. And my wife and I have had a particular challenge with that. It's kind of a heartache at times. So, I talked to Father Anthony about it, and he said, yeah, I'm hearing about this all the time. And right about the time that I called Father Walsh, Diana Martini was setting up the St. Monica group. It's a big deal. It's a big issue, and certainly something that we're all concerned about. And so Father Anthony suggested, why not open it up to the whole parish, and that's what we did. So thank you for all attending. It's really great to see all of you here. I have a little introduction for Father Sebastian, and it's only going to take me about a half an hour, so but I think we cut it down though. Father Sebastian Walsh is a Norbertine canon of the Abbey of St. Michael in the Diocese of Orange, California. After earning a degree in electrical engineering, and I'm sure that this will be an electrifying talk today, so Father Sebastian worked as an intellectual property firm, or in an intellectual property firm before pursuing further education at St. Thomas Aquinas College. We're familiar with that college. We have a couple of our parishioners that have attended there and are attending there. Graduating in 1994, he continued studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., receiving a license in philosophy. Later, while in the seminary, he attended the Pontifical University of St. Thomas at Rome, the Angelicum, where he received a master's degree in sacred theology and a doctorate in philosophy. This guy's kind of smart, it sounds like he's... Since 2006, Father Sebastian has been a professor of philosophy in the seminary program at St. Michael's Abbey, where he is the Dean of Studies. Please give a hearty welcome to Father Sebastian Walsh.
So I've been able to be down here a few times over the last few years, and it's always been good. I think the last time I was here was for a beautiful benefit dinner for Canticle, and some of you may be members of that or have kids that are members of that. Really nice opportunity. I know a number of the people down in this area. I'm familiar, I'm very close, I work closely with Catholic Answers. I'm close friends with Ernie and Mary Grimm, who live down in La Mesa, and a few other people. So it's always a blessing to be here, and I'm glad that I was asked. So thank you for that, Barry, especially. I say Mass normally at Our Lady of Fatima and San Clemente, and once a month, I do like a little question and answer for difficult questions about the Catholic faith, I do that as a service to the parishioners because I know that a priest from the pulpit can't talk about everything he needs to talk about. And there are a lot of questions the faithful have, either about contemporary moral issues or teachings in the history and tradition of the church. But one of the number one questions, probably the single most frequently asked question, goes something like this. Father, I sent my child to 12 years of Catholic school, and now they're not Catholic. What happened? It's one of the most frequently asked questions. And over the years, after I answered that question many times and asking them individually about each kid and what happened or whatever else, together with my blessing, a real blessing that I've had to know so many Catholic families who were able to successfully keep their kids in the faith. That kind of multitude of life experience from all different fronts kind of gave me a lot of information, helpful information that I eventually put down into that book, Always a Catholic. So I'm going to share to you the basics, kind of the highlights of that. And my talk will have two parts. The first part will be preventative medicine. If you have smaller kids, if you got teenagers, what can you do to help them want to keep the faith? And the second part will be corrective medicine. You know, if they've already left the faith, how do you respond? What's the best thing you can do to help them respond, okay? Now, step one is to recognize having children is a risk, okay? You think that, oh, I get to just control what happens in their lives. And by the time they reach 2 years old, you have been freed from that, liberated from that misconception. They discover their free will very quickly, and they exercise it, whether you like it or not. And they don't realize this, but you realize this. Wherever they go, they drag your heart along with them. If they get sick, you're sick for them. If they do really well, you're elated with joy. Wherever they go, your heart goes with them. And it's not until they become parents one day that they understand just how badly they've treated you. They don't understand, right? They don't understand. We had a high school for many years at our Abbey, and that's one of the things I used to try and tell the students. I'm like, you think you're living for yourself, but every decision you make has a huge impact on your family, especially your parents. You're not just living your own life. You live the life of every other person who loves you dearly. And you have to recognize that as you live your life, you know? So anyway, but when kids are young, they don't think about that. It's hard for them to understand that, and it's only when you get older you realize how true that is, huh? So this is a risk, and there are no guarantees because there's free will. So I can give you advice that has to do with, these are the best things you can do to help your kids stay in the faith, but even a parent who's perfect and does everything right, there's no guarantees. Do you understand that? Jesus was the perfect teacher, and he lost one. At 12 disciples, 12 apostles, he lost one. Not because of anything he did wrong. He literally did everything perfect, and yet Judas fell away. He had free will. You see that? So I say this, first of all, to say this is not a complete 100% guarantee. You follow my advice, your kids will always stay Catholic. It's a risk. And you're taking the same risk that God takes whenever he creates a new human person with free will. It's the same risk God takes. And that's maybe part of learning to be a parent, is to start to sympathize with God. When you become a parent, you not only start to understand just how much your own behavior affected your parents, you also start to understand how God looks at you, you know? And so it's an important stage in your own experience, and part of that is giving up control over people you love, right? So don't try and control your children, okay? Especially as they get older. This is probably the single biggest mistake that parents make when their children become adults. They're afraid for their children's salvation, and then they try to control the child, and the child just instinctively runs away from that. You understand? And distances themselves from the parents. Don't try and control your children. You know, you form them when they're young, but by the time they become adults, what you have to do is your role goes from commanding and controlling to advising if they ask, okay? And being a good example. Okay? That's the first thing. Secondly, holiness is not a trick. It's not like I'm going to give you a bunch of tricks and like, oh, do A, B, and C, and then suddenly your kids will be holy or something like that. Holiness is no more a trick than health is, right? Being healthy is not a trick. Being healthy is a result of a lifetime of good choices about your bodily health. Diet, exercise, taking precautions with regard to certain things or whatever, okay? But just as with bodily health, there are a few just simple words of advice you can give someone that will prevent them from, having serious medical problems, or a few simple, so to speak, tricks to prevent people from getting very sick or having serious health problems. So also in the spiritual life, there are some relatively simple things you can do as rules of thumb that can help someone or prevent someone really from falling into a life of dissolution, a life away from God. So I will talk about some of those things. Now, there's one wonderful thing, however, about holiness that's different than health. Holiness is like health of the soul, right? There's one difference. Health of the soul health of the body is not contagious. If you hang around a healthy person, it's not contagious. Sickness is contagious, right? But not health. But holiness is contagious. When you look at the lives of the saints, almost always they grow up together in groups. So because God always wants to make the greater goods better, bodily health is relatively low on the scale of goods, so he doesn't make it contagious. But he does make holiness contagious, okay? And that's a beautiful thing to know and to recognize when it comes to your own children and the life of your kids, okay? So there's a first little just introduction. All right, next. If your children stay Catholic, there is one reason and one reason only that they stay Catholic. If they decide not to stay Catholic, there was one reason and one reason only that they decide not to be Catholic. That reason that determines whether or not they stay Catholic or leave the Catholic faith is if they think that being Catholic will make them happier, they will stay Catholic. If they think that staying Catholic will make them less happy or unhappy, they will stop being Catholic. That's what it comes down to. It comes down to that fundamental reality. We are always seeking for happiness. Now, as I said, I teach philosophy and ethics in particular, and when I would teach our high school students at the Abbey, I used to always have this dialogue that would go something like this. So, why are you sitting in my class today? And the student would say, because I want to get a good grade, Father. And I say, why do you want to get a good grade? Well, because I want to get into a good college, Father. And why do you want to get into a good college? Because I want to make a lot of money, Father. And why do you want to make a lot of money? And at that point, they look at me as if I'm crazy. And like, what do you mean everyone wants a lot of money? I said, I don't want a lot of money. I got a vow of poverty. Why do you want a lot of money? And they kind of get all upset, like I've trampled over their one self-evident principle of their whole life, But everyone wants money. That's the whole reason for life. And I'm like, actually, if you had a bunch of money but you couldn't spend it, would that be any good? Money is for the sake of something else. It's obviously a means to something else. So because I can get what I want. I can be happy if I have all my money, a bunch of money. I'm like, okay, fine, great. Now we finally got to something that's an ultimate explanation for your choices. We'll have to see whether or not money will make you happy. I know lots of rich people seem really miserable, in fact. But the truth is that all of our actions are ultimately, at least implicitly, done for happiness, for the sake of happiness. And so if you want to successfully keep your kids Catholic, your whole role is to communicate to them effectively that being Catholic, staying Catholic, will make them happier than not being Catholic. That's your role. Does that make sense? And if you're trying to get them to come back after having left the faith, your whole role there is to help your children see that coming back to the faith will make them happier than being apart from the faith. That's what it all comes down to, okay? So, how does that work out in the details, huh? How does that work out in the details? Well, in my experience as a priest and seeing many, like I said, many successful families with regard to keeping their kids in the faith, many families that haven't had a lot of success and so forth, there are fundamentally 3 reasons why someone thinks they will be unhappy for staying a Catholic, and conversely, 3 other reasons, the opposite reasons, that make them think that they will be happy staying a Catholic, okay? Reason number 1, negative associations with the practice of the Catholic faith. Negative associations with the practice of the Catholic faith. If your children have negative associations, then they will think that being Catholic is a bad thing, right? And I'll come back to that in a little bit. But conversely, positive associations with the practice of the faith will make them want to stay Catholic. Will make them think, oh, I remember being a Catholic made me happy, right? I enjoyed that. 2, difficulty in living out the demands, the moral demands of the Catholic faith, right? There's a famous line by G.K. Chesterton. He said, it's not that the Catholic faith has been tried and found wanting, it's that it's been found difficult and left untried, right? So very often that's what happens. People, they find that keeping the moral teachings of the church is difficult, and because of that, they leave the practice of the Catholic faith. Conversely, if someone becomes convinced that it's possible to keep the teachings of the church, and not only is it possible, but that it's life-giving, they will stay Catholic. And then the third reason why people leave or stay has to do with education, okay? If someone thinks through their education, they've been educated in such a way as to believe that the Catholic Church is a source of evil and injustice in the world, they won't want to be associated with that church. If conversely, they think that the Catholic Church is a cause of great good, the greatest good, in fact, then they'll want to stay Catholic. So those are the 3 topics, basically, that I want to cover and kind of helping you with regard to your own kids. 1, positive associations. 2, the possibility of living out the difficult demands of the gospel. 3, good Catholic education. I told you about the people who always ask me, they say, I sent my kid to 12 years of Catholic school. Why aren't they Catholic today? And sometimes all the way through college, 16 years. And I tell them, usually, you're a victim of false advertising. It's true. I'll tell you, in my own family, it's a really fascinating story. My dad was one of 8 kids, and the whole family was Catholic, very much so. And that whole next generation, all the grandkids, so me and my brother and all my cousins on both sides, my dad was the only one who married out of the church, and therefore my brother and I were the only 2 grandkids that were not given a Catholic education. We're the only Catholics today. Every other one of the grandchildren went to Catholic school and got their faith educated right out of them. Isn't that amazing? Just to show you just how bad the state of Catholic education is today and how careful parents have to be when it comes to that. So I'll return to that. I'll return to that a little bit later. Let's go back to the first point, positive versus negative associations, What are some sources of negative associations of the practice of the Catholic faith? 1, negative associations with their family life, okay? Now, just to talk a little bit about associations and how that works, before you can think or reason, you can associate. Even when you can think carefully, still, we make lots of associations and make decisions based on that. I'm old enough to remember when television commercials used to give you a reason for buying their product. They don't do that anymore. Now they just give you associations. This really struck me once when I was about 19. I was sitting there watching like a sporting event or something, and on comes a commercial for some beer. And the entire commercial was this giant semi-truck with the beer label on the side there, and it drives past this street corner with a Ferrari and 3 girls in bikinis jumping up and down, screaming at the passing of the beer truck. And my first thought was, they should be in an institution. That is not a reason to buy this beer. It's a reason to feel sorry for the people who are jumping up and down there, But that's literally it. Look, excited, beautiful girls with a Ferrari, and I'm supposed to buy the product there. You see that? So that's how we're treated by our society. Everything's just about associations, images, whatever else, okay? And your children, for sure, when they're little, can do nothing else. They can do nothing else. That's why, you spank them or you put them in timeout or you do whatever. When they do something wrong, you give them a negative association with their bad behavior, right? Plato was famous for saying that the essence of education is making the good pleasant and the bad painful, okay? Just a simple rule about education, huh? So, in any case, that's what happens. And it's really important for you to realize you're not going to convince your small children by way of rational argument that they should be good. And I always give this simple example. Take an ordinary 3-year-old and give them a choice between a fully paid for college education and a bowl of ice cream. Your 3-year-old will choose a bowl of ice cream every single time. I guarantee you. That's the only good they know. They have no idea what is this college education thing, whatever. Hopefully by the time they get to high school, they would choose the education. I'm not sure, but maybe. Hopefully. But the little kid, they just can't see the good there. And so they just choose the thing that they know. So guess what? Don't try and, when your kids are little, don't try and form positive associations with college educations or long, lots of prayers or whatever. Give them sensible goods that they enjoy. So for example, when it's time to make their sacraments, right? They make their first communion. They have to do their first confession before their first communion, right? What do? Well, first of all, you spend quality time, mom and dad both, with the child one-on-one individually, especially if you've got a big family that's really prized by the children, huh? One-on-one, instructing them in the faith, showing them how much it's important to you. Then you take them down, you make an individual appointment with a pastor or associate pastor, some priest you know, and you take them down for confession, and you wait outside in the church while they make their confession. And when they come out from confession, you give them a big hug, and you tell them how proud you are of them, and then you go home and you have a party. And then you have First Communion, you do the same thing, right? And you do that for the other sacraments. Positive associations with the practice of the faith, the practice of the sacraments, right? The same thing when it comes to following the liturgical calendar of the year, right? So when there's a major feast day, a major solemnity in the church, make sure the kids know that. Oh, we're celebrating during that. Yep, we get a break during Lent. It's St. Joseph's Day, break during Lent, or whatever, right? So there's one thing, just make sure that you have age-appropriate positive associations. Now, as they get older, they get to be, teenagers and things like that. Now, obviously, they're going to want something more substantial than, say, ice cream or donuts or something. What you do when they get older now, and what a teenager, especially a teenage boy and a teenage girl, really want, is they want to be supported and encouraged in the good. And so it's really important that you say things like this. I'm so proud of you to see you that you're staying after church and praying on your own. That really is a beautiful thing. Thank you, son. Thank you, daughter, for doing that, Give the children a sense of your approval and the fact that you are proud of them, right? If you're never telling your kids good things and you're proud of them for the good things they do, then they'll be discouraged, right? So that's another thing that's really important to do. Age-appropriate affirmation. Does that make sense? And that's just the first simple thing. I have a good friend of mine who, he and his wife have 10 children, beautiful children. They've all stayed in the faith, and they're all fervently Catholic. And part of it is the fact that they were really good about observing the church's liturgical cycle at home. They were really good about, when each of their kids had their sacraments, about doing those positive affirmations I told you about and so forth, huh? So that's step one. Here's another source of either negative or positive associations with the faith. The family life, and especially your family life as it relates to the Catholic faith, okay? If you do not obviously look happier to be a Catholic, why would you expect your kids to believe it's going to happen? Right? Now, I am as traditional Catholics come. But I have one complaint that often happens among traditional Catholics. That traditional Catholics are often naysayers in the sense of they tend to be negative about everything going on in the world. It's always negative, negative, negative. And what often happens is, and I know exactly where it comes from, a lot of traditional Catholics, they became traditional Catholics because when they were young, they lived you heard it, wayward youth. And so they are so afraid that this is going to happen to their kids, all they talk about to their kids is hell, don't do that, you're going to hell, don't do that, you're going to hell. I do agree your kids need to know there's a hell, but that cannot be the gospel, the good news, okay? It can't be the heart of what you're teaching them. What they need to see is you're joyful, you love being a Catholic. They need to see that. They don't need to constantly and predominantly hear, you're going to hell if you do this, you do that, right? They don't need your fear-based, from my past life, I don't want you to make the same mistakes I did. They don't need that as their primary source of motivation in practicing the faith, okay? And then you can also have these kind of interesting things. You'll get people who are very outwardly devout when it comes to certain things. You know, there's 6 kids, the girls all wear mantillas, their hands are folded and they're kneeling bolt upright during Mass, and everything's perfect with regard to the liturgical practices of the faith, and they're very orthodox with regard to their teaching. But then, like, dad's an alcoholic, or mom and dad don't have any affection between them. And so what do they have? They feel like we have all these things to be Catholic, but I just feel miserable all the time in my family, right? I feel miserable. I see my mom and dad aren't really, either themselves aren't really joyful, or they're not practicing the faith sort of thing, and they look like they're practicing, they're doing the motions on the outside, but there's no interior transformation, there's no love of Christ, there's nothing attractive that makes the kids really want to be and stay that way. So that's another thing. You have to go beyond just the outward forms of the practicing the faith, and orthodoxy is not enough. You need holiness and you need joy. Those 2 things are really important for convincing your kids that being a Catholic will make them want to stay Catholic. So they need to see, like, it's good, it's a fun family being Catholic, right? So, and I'm a big advocate for big families. You have whatever God can give you, you know what I mean? Each person has to be able to figure that out, and whatever God can give you, not everyone gets that from God. But some beautiful big Catholic families, I've noticed one of the things that they have in common is they have a lot of fun together, as a family. It's a really beautiful thing. I remember one super cute. One of my friends has 9 kids. She has 9 kids, and she was telling me the story that they were watching this movie. It was called Cheaper by the Dozen. Do you remember that old black and white Cheaper by the Dozen? And so she was watching this movie with her youngest. And she was watching and seeing all the antics going on, and she says to her mom, "Oh, Mama, it looks so fun. I wish I were a member of a big family." And she was like the 9th one. She had no idea. Anyway, fun, enjoy, those sort of positive associations are an important part, right, of keeping your kids Catholic, make them want to stay Catholic, okay? Now, here's one very subtle mistake that parents often make that I want to warn you against. It may be, in some sense, the single biggest unknown cause of kids departing from the faith. In every marriage, there's some kind of inequality between the devotion of the husband and the wife. It's extremely rare, if not non-existent, that one of the 2 spouses, that they're both exactly the same level of devotion and practice of the faith. Almost always one of the 2 spouses is more devout, okay? If there's a large gap between the husband and wife in that regard, the temptation for the devout spouse will be to do something like this. I need to protect my children from my non-devout spouse. I got to protect my children from their dad. I got to protect my children from their mom. And so then what happens is they hear these things. Don't be like your mother. She doesn't go to church every Sunday. Don't be like her. Don't be like your father. He doesn't pray enough. We all say the family rosary, but he doesn't join us. Or whatever, right? You get this kind of separation between husband and wife like that. Now, what you think you're doing is, I'm protecting my child to make sure they don't follow the bad example of their other parent. That's what you think you're doing. You think you're doing the right thing. But what your children are hearing is this: the Catholic faith drives a wedge between my parents. That's what they hear and experience. And then, what child wants to be part of a religion that separates his parents? You tell me. Go ahead, tell me. Which child wants to be part of a religion that drives their parents apart? It's not going to end well, okay? So, what do I tell that more devout spouse when they come to me? I say, listen, here's what the church actually teaches. The believing husband sanctifies the unbelieving wife. The believing wife sanctifies the unbelieving husband. What does that mean? It means that your children should see that because you are a Catholic, you are more loving, more sacrificial, more affectionate, more attentive to your spouse. You draw closer to your spouse. This is St. Monica's society is here. What do you think St. Monica did? Her husband was a pagan. But because she was Catholic, she was so good at showing him sacrificial love. You see that? That's what you got to do in a case like this. You have to show your children that being Catholic unites their parents, doesn't divide them. And don't worry about telling them about all the faults of your other spouse. Believe me, your children know both of your faults perfectly well without your help. They don't need you to explain what's wrong with their other parent, okay? So just ignore that part, and your message should always be to your children, well, you got to love your mother. If she gave you life. So you got to pray for her that she'll love the faith more. But faith is a gift, and so I never criticize your mom if she doesn't have that gift. That's a gift from God. I pray for her every day, and you see how much I try to love her and encourage her by my example. In the same way with the wife, look, you have to pray for your father. He gave you life. Always be grateful to your father for giving you life. Because he gave you life, who deserves your help more than your father? This is a kind of message that you have to give to your children, that being a Catholic for you means uniting them to both their parents, especially their parent that isn't practicing the faith that much. And if they do that, they see, look, mom or dad who's very devout is always encouraging me to be in a good relationship with my non-devout parent. Then they'll think to themselves, that's because he or she is Catholic, and I like that, and I want to stay Catholic, So that's a subtle problem that happens in many, many marriages. So I try to give you the right advice when it comes to that. And what I found is that if parents do follow that advice, it ends up better for the kids, okay? Positive associations with the practice of the faith. There are some cases where, try as you might, you've done everything right, and then something external happens. We have only to think of some of the priestly abuse scandals that happened in the last decades, and a child from a very devout family gets abused by a priest or a church minister or something like that. First of all, we've learned our lesson. Just because someone's a priest doesn't mean that they're a saint. And so treat your children around priests the same way you would treat your children around other people, with a sense of, care and whatever. Don't let them go off by themselves with an adult unsupervised, right? But how do you respond to that? In cases like that, I'm convinced that the Lord is not going to let that child ultimately be lost as a result of that failing on the part of the clergy. I think about the Garden of Gethsemane when Peter sliced off the ear of the high priest's servant Malchus. What does Jesus do? He heals the ear. And I see that as a kind of a microcosm of what happens, what God is ultimately going to do with any victim of clerical abuse, right? He had an example of clerical abuse, Peter just cutting off the ear of this guy. And Jesus healed it, right? So You have to have hope in a case like that, and and be very, very patient and just trust the Lord to heal something that you can't heal. Those are the very painful cases. The church has done a pretty good job of addressing that going forward. I think there's more the church can and should do on that front. That has to do with priestly formation and making sure that priests are formed the way they should be, and they aren't ordained if they don't have that clear evidence of a holy character. But nevertheless, thanks be to God, things are improving on that front. And there aren't really that many problems most recently in the last couple decades, thanks be to God. But always be careful, always be careful. So that's number one. Positive or negative associations with the practice of the faith. 2, which one what did I want to do first here? Hold on. Let's talk about the education, the second one, Catholic education. Your children, if they've grown up in modern society, will likely have heard over and over again that the Catholic Church is a source of grave injustice, not only in the modern world, but in the history of the world, right? And that comes in many forms. The church hates women because women can't be priests and bishops. That's one argument you'll get. The church hates people with same-sex attraction and people with gender dysphoria because the church won't let them live their lives loving who they want to love. The church stands for colonialism or, imposing Western European, values on the rest of the world. Whatever. There's all sorts of different things, injustices, so to speak, that the church has been guilty of, all the way to, when Junipero Serra was out here trying to convert the Indians and bringing disease with them and so forth, right? There's every kind of, imaginable accusation of injustice, right? And much of that needs to be counteracted by a proper Catholic education, okay? As I said before, most of the educational institutions that go by the name Catholic today are nothing of the sort. And in fact, this may shock you, but I will tell you the truth about this. It is probably better to send your child to a public institution than to a school that has the name Catholic on average today. I know that's a scandalous thing to say, but I told you about the experience with my own family. So I'm going to give you a little history of the decay of Catholic education in the United States in particular. Back in the early 1960s, or mid-1960s, there was a conference in Minnesota called the Land O'Lakes Conference, just like the butter, right? Land O'Lakes. And that conference was headed by all the flagship Catholic universities in the country, Notre Dame, Georgetown, Catholic University, you name it, all the high-profile Catholic schools, okay? Now, already for many decades, those schools had been teaching things contrary to the faith. Now, how do I know that? My father, one of 8 children, was raised a good Catholic. He went to Notre Dame in the mid-1950s. Do you know what my father was taught by the priests at Notre Dame in the mid-1950s? This is not post-Vatican II, in the mid-1950s. He was taught there's no devil, there's no hell, and the only thing you need to be saved is to feed the poor. That was the gospel that was being taught at Notre Dame, the flagship university, Catholic university in the United States in the 1950s. And these were the supposedly most educated priests in the United States giving him this education. So no matter later on in life, no matter what you tried to tell him, he's like, no, the priests at Notre Dame said this, right? So Catholic education had been corrupted for many, many decades. And what happened at the Land O'Lakes Conference was they all got together and they made an official statement that said, in the name of academic freedom, we can no longer consider ourselves subject to the teachings of the magisterium when it comes to Catholic education. We have to be able to offer an education that is free from any restrictions by the teaching of the church And they all agreed to it. And that's what happened. Schools like Fordham are no longer, they don't even have the name Catholic anymore. They abandoned that 15, 20 years ago, right? A lot of these so-called Jesuit universities, they did that, huh? So this is what happened. And then unsuspecting, good-hearted Catholic parents were paying good money to send their kids to these non-Catholic Catholic universities, these false advertisers, and their kids were being taught the same kind of stuff that my dad was being taught. And then those same people came back and were teachers at the high school level and the grade school level. And then suddenly it just filtered down, all this false doctrine after false doctrine after false doctrine. And what happens in these schools that have the name Catholic but aren't in fact Catholic is they are actually programmed to destroy the faith of your children because they know what the traditional teaching is, and their whole mission is to undo that. At least if your kids go to a secular school, they don't care. They don't know what the church's teaching is. So your kids at least can say, that's not even what the church ever taught. Your kids can just say, you have no idea what Catholicism is, and they're at least a little bit safer. But when they get these clever people who have been badly, programmed to kind of unwind by way of sophisms and clever, arguments to unwind the Catholic faith in your kids, it's not surprising. Father, I sent my kids to 12 years of Catholic school. Why aren't they Catholic today? So most of my aunts actually went down here to USD. Even in those days, in the early 1960s, a lot went wrong, and so my aunts have some problems with the view of their faith. By the time they were sending their children, I had one cousin who had stopped practicing his faith already by the time he got into college. But he wanted to go to USD, where his mom went to went to college. And you know what happened? He left after 1 year. He said, boy, those people really hate Catholicism. I'm not even practicing as a Catholic, but I don't want to be with them. That's how bad it's gotten in a lot of these places, okay? So, what's the remedy? You cannot, absolutely do not trust the name Catholic on any Catholic institution. I don't care if it's a grade school. Grade school, high school, college. You do the research and make sure they are really Catholic schools, that they're faithful to the teaching of the magisterium, okay? And make the sacrifices involved in that. And tell your kids, no, I'm not going to spend the money to send you just anywhere. I'll send you to an actual Catholic school, but I'm not going to send you to just a place that you want to go where your faith is going to be, deprogrammed, right? So find out what kind of clubs they have on campus. Find out about the teachers and so forth, what the makeup of the faculty is. Does a campus abide by Catholic teaching, or for example, do they provide health care for abortion at their Catholic school, like many of those colleges do, and so forth, right? Find out the details, okay? And don't ever let yourself just be persuaded, it's got the name Catholic, it should be fine. The chances are it won't be. So you gotta be really, really careful, okay? There are resources that you can have with regard to dealing with a lot of the problems that your children will hear on the media or in their own educational institutions. You're very fortunate to have right close by Catholic Answers here. That's the mission of Catholic Answers, is basically Catholic education responding to the challenges, the false narratives that the world gives about the Catholic Church. So make use of those resources. Make sure your kids know about them, If you are confronted with some problem, for example, your kids are convinced by some arguments of atheism or something, and you don't feel competent to answer, then refer them to someone who is, either an educated priest or to some, one of the people at Catholic Answers. We have resources, and use those resources when it comes to the Catholic education of your kids, okay? All right. The last thing that we have to deal with, and that is the difficulty in living out the Catholic faith, okay? So these difficulties that have to do with the practice of Catholic faith, when they usually begin at some point in high school. And they're almost always over the church's teaching on marriage, family, sexuality, those things. Those are the larger questions that people find. By the time they're 12 or 13 years old, they are face to face with the fact that they have original sin. Original sin in children manifests itself by temper tantrums. Original sin in teenagers manifests itself by temptations to impurity and things like that, okay? So this is an area where you can greatly help your children, okay? First of all, it's important to be very careful about inculcating or encouraging a form of scrupulosity with your children. And I want to talk a little bit about scrupulosity so you understand it. In those families, especially where the emphasis is on avoiding evil, avoiding hell, punishment, and so forth. And again, please, I absolutely think your kids need to know about hell and punishment and those things. I absolutely believe your kids need to know that. But when the primary focus is on that, there tends to be a greater likelihood that your kids will fall into scrupulosity. What are the characteristics of scrupulosity? There's really two primary characteristics of scrupulosity. One, the scrupulous person wants to have mathematical certitude whether or not they're in a state of grace. They want to know with absolute certitude, am I in a state of grace or not, right? The second difficulty with scrupulosity is for them, it's more important to avoid evil than to do good, okay? And I'll give you a very simple example of where that comes out. You have a teenager, and he's struggling with impure thoughts. And so he thinks to himself, shoot, did I give consent to that? I mean, was that a mortal sin? Oh, it's time for communion. I don't want to commit a sacrilege. I better not go to communion. They only think about avoiding evil. They never think about doing good. Like what a joy it is that you bring to the heart of Jesus when you are united to him in Holy Communion, right? So they don't think about the good part. They think about the bad part, and that's all they think about. Avoiding punishment, avoiding sin. And that becomes the heart of their spiritual life. And that cannot be the heart of anyone's spiritual life. St. Thomas says it's more important in the moral life to do good than to avoid evil. Sometimes you have to take a risk to do good, okay? And there's a parable in the Gospels about this very point. You know the parable of the talents. So this master goes and he gives 1 talent to each of his servants. There's 2 different parables. Let me give you the one where he gives 5 talents to one, 2 talents to another, and 1 talent to the third. I'll do that one because they both have the same kind of message there. So the one guy with the 5 talents, he goes out there and he takes a risk because he trades. He trades, and when you trade, there's a possibility that maybe you'll lose something when you trade. Everyone knows that. But he takes the risk, and he trades, and he gets 5 more talents. And then the master says, welcome into your master's joy. It's a happy ending. Then the guy with 2 talents, he does the same thing. He doubles his talents, and now he also hears from the master, welcome to your master's joy, right? But then the guy with 1 talent, he buries it. And then when the master comes back, he says, here's your talent back. And how does that exchange go? He says to his master, I knew you were a harsh master. That is a voice of scrupulosity, brothers and sisters. The scrupulous person looks at God as a harsh master who's primarily interested in punishment. The healthy spiritual life says, God is my Father who's on my side, not my enemy who's looking for the least excuse to punish me. And there's where the sin of scrupulosity comes in. Treating God like he wants you to fail. instead of treating God like he's on your side. A loving father. Jesus always saying stuff like that. Which of you, when your son asks for a loaf of bread, will give him a snake, or an egg will give you a scorpion? If you, being evil, know how to give your children good things, does not your Father in heaven know much better? But scrupulosity looks at God and says, you are a harsh master. You see that? So there's fear. And so what happens? He doesn't want to take the risk of doing good. The risk of doubling his talent. So he doesn't take the risk because he's more interested in avoiding evil than doing good. That is a scrupulous person in that parable. You see that? The importance of encouraging your children. Sometimes you have to take a risk. You know, getting married involves a risk. You might fail. There might be, you're in it with another fallible person. Having children, take a risk. I told you about that at the beginning of this talk. Something might go wrong. Do good anyway. You notice in that parable of the talents, you expect, so to speak, you think that there should be three different possibilities. The guy who trades and succeeds, the guy who trades and fails, and the guy who doesn't trade. Isn't that what you expect? But instead, everyone who trades succeeds. What is our Lord telling us in that parable? He's telling us that he's on your side. If you try, he'll come to your assistance. You can't fail with the Lord. All things are possible with God. You may fail in the here and now, in the short term. You might lose the battle, but you're going to win the war. You understand that? And that's the sort of message you have to give to your kids when it comes to their moral life, okay? Because they're going to be daunted by this idea of like how hard it is. And you got to remind them, God doesn't have a limited number of pardons. So what do? You get them the frequent confession. You go to confession with them to show them there's no shame in going to confession frequently. You want to go to confession on Saturday? Every Saturday, let's go to confession together. And give your children a sense of hope. It's okay. You might try and fail, but that's just like the apostles who are fishing all night and catch nothing. What happens at the end? Jesus says, try one more time. And they catch more fish in one catch than if they had successfully fished the whole night. You tell your children that when they're struggling to keep the teachings of the church. It's okay, son. It's okay, daughter. You just keep lowering your net, and eventually the Lord will give you what you need. Eventually. But never give up. Never despair of the mercy of God. Okay? That's a message you have to tell your children when they're feeling overwhelmed by the difficulty of keeping the difficult teachings of the Catholic faith. It's not easy to be a saint. Jesus wasn't easy on his apostles, you know. He called Peter Satan. So that's the most important thing. Now, there are certain things that you can do as parents to protect your kids, and the one thing I want to address in particular. As a priest, I really am aware of that, and I'm especially aware of it given my age and where I grew up kind of in recent history here. When I was a child and even a young adult, the internet did not exist. And many of you people will remember that. There was no internet when we were kids and when we were young adults. When I joined the Abbey, I was 29. This is 1998. The internet was just getting started. Probably late 90s is when the internet was started. So my generation, which is a lot of your generation, my generation never even had to think about what was it like to grow up with the internet. And by the time the internet came around, you were fully formed morally. You had your moral habits. You had a sense of a filter of what's right and wrong and whatever. So you could use the internet well. It never even occurred to you that maybe if your children are exposed to this, that they're not going to have the same sense you have and the same habits and moral formation that you have. So as a priest, I'm going to say something else that's shocking to you. But when I hear confessions of children and young people, teenagers, who have a problem with habitual pornography use, I will often ask them, when did this start? Do you know the average age that I usually hear? 9 years old. And their parents have no idea they're 16, and their parents still don't know. Because they're very clever at hiding it, because they're very ashamed, but they also feel like they can't stop. And the internet is fishing for your children. It's not indifferent. It's not like your children are searching these things out. The internet is fishing for them. I'll tell you exactly how it works. They're on some school project on the internet, completely legitimate. But over on the side panel, there's some advertisement for some funny game. So, they want, it's exactly age appropriate, like a game for a 10-year-old. So they're like, I'm kind of bored, I've got ADD or whatever, and I click on, there's the game there, and then they're sort of playing it. But then now on the side panel, instead of having games there, there's like advertisements for lingerie, swimsuits, vacations, and things like that. And there's lots of attractive models up there. And then your kids are seeing that out of the side of their either peripheral vision. And then they're kind of curious, well, I wonder, that's kind of interesting. And they click on that. And then they're on that. And then in the sidebar now, it's not just, swimsuits anymore. It's lines, it's things that go to pornography. It's how the internet fishes for your kids. And if a parent, because from my generation, we never dealt with that. It never even occurs to us that that's something that can happen. So parents are giving their kids phones when they're 9, 10 years old. They're giving them free access to the internet when they're 9, 10 years old. Oh, it's for school, it's fine. No, it's not. You have to have the internet completely locked down. Completely locked down. And your children have to be able to use it only in a public space when you're present. When you're talking about children. I know that sounds like, oh, well, no one does that. Well, guess what? Everyone is looking at pornography now because no one does that. Do you want your children to be like everyone or not? No. This is one of the big problems that has come up. I will even tell you one case just to show you how careful you have to be. One of my friends, he told me, well, okay, we got our son a phone, but it doesn't have the internet. He's got a little flip phone. The only thing he can get is phone calls and text messages. So he's very proud of himself. His 12-year-old son now has his phone, and he's been very careful about the internet. But I, being a priest and having heard everything, I said to him, does that text message, can he get pictures on that? And he said, I don't know. I said, check, and if he can, make sure he can't. He's like, okay. He checks, like, yeah, he could get pictures on it. So I disabled that. Now he can just get texts with no pictures. I said, great. 2 weeks later, he got a text message from one of his soccer teammates. It was a group text to all the soccer team. All his 12-year-old soccer buddies. He couldn't open it because it had a picture attached. His friends all could open it, and it was a violent pornographic image from his 12-year-old soccer guy friend. And he was spared that because I told his dad about it. I guarantee you guys don't think about those things. So these are the things that you have to be really careful about to protect your kids. It's going to be hard enough to live the moral life without those kinds of temptations and challenges. You have to be really careful and thoughtful about how to protect your kids when it comes to these things, okay? You have to be careful about those things. So, when all said and done, as I said before, encourage them to get to confession. God does not give a limited number of pardons. Don't be afraid of God. God's on your side. Persevere, okay?